The airport road was empty, not because the day was done, but because the promise of democracy had been told to stay indoors. In a city that once danced to the rhythm of engines and footsteps, silence had become the loudest sound. Tanzania, the beating heart of East Africa, had fallen still. Not in peace, but in pause. A curfew had turned its citizens into shadows, watching through windows as soldiers patrolled the streets they once owned. This is where stories of nations often end in fear, in silence, in resignation. But tonight, something different was breathing beneath that quiet. A new generation was whispering into the dark. Gen Z, raised on Wi-Fi and dreams, refused to bow to disconnection. They understood that shutting down the internet could not shut down awareness. And if you are listening to this, it means the signal has reached you. Stay with us. Subscribe, share, and let your attention become resistance. Because silence feeds the powerful, but witness empowers the truth. The story of Tanzania's silence began with a voice that once promised change. When President Samia Suluhu Hassan rose to power 3 years ago, the nation exhaled with relief. A woman of calm presence, of reasoned tone, of reformist words, she was hailed as proof that democracy in Africa could still renew itself. For a season, that promise felt real. Exiled journalists returned. Opposition leaders crossed borders back home. Newspapers reopened. Church pulpits, once fearful of consequence, began to speak again. The world applauded. The people believed. But promise is the cheapest currency in politics. It costs nothing to offer and everything to keep. Somewhere between speeches and signatures, the space for truth began to shrink again. Laws were refined, not repealed. Permits were required for gatherings that had once been spontaneous. Freedom of expression became freedom to agree. The same system that had smiled for cameras was quietly sharpening its teeth. The bureaucratic voice returned, the one that says curfews are for your safety, surveillance is for your protection, censorship is for your peace. Yet beneath those soothing syllables, the people recognized the tone of an older era. Tanzania had changed its vocabulary, not its nature. At the University of Dar es Salaam, students noticed that debates about electoral reform drew the gaze of plainclothes officers. In Arusha, market women discovered that questioning officials could now be labeled unlawful assembly. In Mwanza, young professionals began whispering their frustrations over slow internet connections that seemed to lag most whenever politics was mentioned. And still, many tried to hope. They remembered the president's early words about transparency, equality, renewal. They wanted to believe that the tightening was temporary, that the promise would return once stability was secured. But authoritarianism never loosens on its own. It must be forced open by courage. As dusk descended on election day, Dar es Salaam, the city of 7 million souls, stood still. Shops shuttered early. Radios murmured official statements about order and harmony. Yet in the apartments above, citizens exchanged looks that said more than any broadcast could. We have been here before. The first tremor of the coming storm was not a protest, not a gunshot, but an emptiness, a capital city gone silent. That silence was not peace. It was warning. It told a story every Tanzanian knew in their bones, that governments which fear their people soon teach the people to fear back. And somewhere in that silence, a seed of defiance sprouted. Gen Z, children of the digital dawn, began to connect the dots their elders had learned not to join. They asked, quietly at first, the most dangerous question in any controlled society. Why? Why must power always mean fear? Why must order require obedience? They did not yet know it, but that question would echo far beyond Tanzania's borders. It would travel through screens, across oceans, into the hearts of those who remembered their own struggles for voice. When a generation decides it will no longer inherit fear, what happens next, revolution or revelation? It did not begin with riots. It began with reason. At the University of Dar es Salaam, students gathered in lecture halls to ask a simple question. How can an electoral commission be independent when every member is appointed by the president? There were no slogans, no megaphones, only discussion. Yet in fragile democracies, discussion itself can sound like defiance. Police arrived before the dialogue ended, not to arrest anyone, at least, not yet, to stand in corners, notebooks open, reminding everyone that even knowledge is monitored. The students kept their voices low, but in that hush lay rebellion. Across the country, similar conversations were unfolding in markets, in cafes, in WhatsApp groups that pulsed with digital life. Gen Z, a generation raised to question algorithms, began questioning authority with the same logic. They had grown up online, mastering the power of connection. And when they realized that connection could expose hypocrisy, the state saw something it feared more than opposition: accountability. The government responded with the oldest tricks in the new age. First, ignore. Let the noise tire itself out. Then, deny. Call it exaggeration. When that failed, accuse. Blame foreign agents, opposition parties, Western media, anyone but yourself. And finally, suppress. The suppression came quietly. A journalist's credentials under review, a student group temporarily suspended, an activist invited for questioning. Step by step, the system redefined legality until resistance itself became a crime. But the young did not vanish. They adapted. When police banned meetings, they moved online. When officials watched Facebook, they switched to encrypted chat. When the press grew silent, they became the press. Videos of intimidation, arrests, and protests began surfacing, evidence that truth could still find a route through fear. Then, one night, the videos stopped. At first, people thought the networks were slow. Then they realized the networks were being strangled. Social media froze mid-scroll. Messages failed to send. Live streams ended mid-sentence. Tanzania had not lost connection, it had been cut. NetBlocks confirmed what the people already knew: deliberate throttling of the internet. Not a technical failure, but a political decision. The shutdown was surgical, precise, and perfectly timed, arriving just as footage of police clashes began to spread. It was censorship disguised as malfunction, repression framed as maintenance. For young Tanzanians, it felt like the ground itself had vanished. Their protests had lived online, hashtags as banners, posts as placards, and now even that battlefield was gone. Yet silence carries its own power. In the dark, the question grew louder. What are they so afraid we might see? And across Africa, the echoes answered. Activists in Senegal, Ghana, and Burkina Faso sent VPN tutorials. Bloggers in Kenya mirrored Tanzanian footage on foreign servers. Even diaspora students in London and Atlanta began using the same hashtags, refusing to let the blackout erase the story. For the authorities, it was control. For the youth, it was confirmation proof that fear had switched sides. Because when governments must hide the truth to hold power, their legitimacy is already crumbling. But when silence becomes strategy, will the young accept invisibility or reinvent connection? By the time the sun rose over Dar es Salaam, the hospitals had become silent witnesses. Ambulances moved without sirens, their flashing lights swallowed by curfew. Inside, young men and women arrived with injuries that required explanation but received none. Some said they had fallen. Others claimed accidents. Everyone understood the truth. In Tanzania, even pain needed permission to speak. Doctors treated wounds while avoiding questions. Nurses charted symptoms, but not causes. Medical staff had learned the unspoken rule: healing was allowed. Documentation was not. A nation that once prided itself on hospitality was now perfecting the art of forgetting. Outside those hospital walls, the economy bled differently. With the internet throttled to a whisper, digital payments froze. Shops that survived on mobile money shut their doors. Freelancers lost clients abroad. Families who relied on remittances could not receive them. The markets of Arusha fell quiet, not because goods had vanished, but because trust had. The government called it temporary maintenance. Businesses called it ruin, and the people called it what it was: punishment. Internationally, the responses came dressed in the language of diplomacy. There are reports. We are monitoring the situation. We urge all sides to exercise restraint. No one named the side that carried guns. No one mentioned the silence that came from power, not protest. Western governments preferred stability to sympathy. Tanzania was a partner in trade, in counterterrorism, in optics. Outrage was a luxury reserved for less strategic nations. But within Africa, the reaction was sharper, quieter, and more personal. Young people from Nairobi to Accra recognized the pattern immediately. They had seen this play before the script of managed democracy, where elections arrive on schedule but truth does not, where constitutions remain intact but the conscience of leadership erodes, where freedom is practiced only on paper and participation is permitted only in praise. A protester interviewed by the BBC before the blackout sealed the nation's mouth, said it simply: "We are tired, not angry, not violent, just tired." Tired of pretending progress was being made while living proof of regression surrounded them. That sentence spread like scripture across social media before the screens went dark. We are tired. 3 words that carried an entire generation's exhaustion. In Mwanza, a group of young professionals gathered offline, using Bluetooth-based mesh apps to send updates from street to street. Their courage was ordinary and therefore extraordinary. They did not dream of overthrowing the government. They dreamed of making it honest. But in nations allergic to scrutiny, honesty is heresy. Meanwhile, in government offices, reports were filed in the clinical language of control. Public disorder contained. Internet stability under review. Curfew effective. The tone was bureaucratic, bloodless. But the reality beneath those words was red and breathing. And still, the protests adapted. They became smaller, faster, harder to crush. Groups of 5 would chant, disperse, reappear elsewhere. Their slogans changed from "freedom now" to "count us fairly." A movement that had begun in theory had evolved into resilience. Every dictatorship underestimates the patience of youth until that patience expires. The state believed silence meant surrender. It didn't. It meant strategy. Across the continent, the whispers turned into a low hum of solidarity. In Burkina Faso, where Ibrahim Traore moment had already become shorthand for youthful courage, Tanzanian protesters found inspiration. In Senegal, Kenya, and Ghana, activists shared advice on safe documentation, on cloud backups, on surviving long nights without connection. And somewhere in that darkness, hope flickered faint but alive. Because repression that efficient can only exist when people believe they are alone. The blackout, meant to isolate, instead illuminated how connected the struggle had become. When ordinary people risk their comfort for justice, when they endure silence rather than surrender, they change the moral weather of their nation. If democracy demands silence to survive, is it still democracy? Tell me below, has your country known this kind of night? What began in Tanzania was not confined to its borders. A hashtag that once carried the name of a single nation began to appear in timelines from Lagos to Nairobi. Videos of street protests re-uploaded by strangers thousands of miles away. VPN tutorials written in Swahili, translated into Wolof, then into Twi. Africa's youngest generation had discovered its oldest truth, that injustice anywhere on the continent echoes everywhere. Across Kenya, students whispered that what happened in Dar es Salaam could happen in Nairobi. In Senegal, activists reminded their followers that silence was the soil where tyranny grows. In Burkina Faso, where young Captain Ibrahim Traore had already become a symbol of defiance, his story resurfaced online as both warning and encouragement. They called it the Ibrahim Traore moment, a flash when youth stopped waiting for permission to demand accountability. This awakening did not travel by aeroplane or broadcast tower. It moved through code packets of data, fragments of courage. Governments could throttle the internet, but not the instinct to connect. Bluetooth became lifeline, whispers became networks, and networks became movements. For older generations, this energy was unsettling. They remembered the chaos of post-independence years, the coups and collapses. To them, order was safety. But to Gen Z, born long after those storms, order without opportunity was a different kind of violence, quiet, polite, and endless. What united them was not ideology, but exhaustion. From Accra to Dar es Salaam, young Africans were done being told that patience was virtue when patience had become paralysis. They did not seek to burn their nations down, they sought to reboot them. And so, a new rhythm pulsed through the continent, a heartbeat of awareness, defiance, and dignity. A generation that had once been dismissed as distracted by phones was now using those very screens as shields, as mirrors, as megaphones. They were saying to their leaders, "We see you now." The question was no longer if change would come, but when and who would stand where when it did. Night still rules Dar es Salaam. The curfew has turned the city into a rehearsal of obedience, quiet streets, shuttered shops, the hum of power generators where conversation once lived. Yet in the silence, something sacred is taking shape. Possibility. President Samia Suluhu Hassan stands at a crossroads familiar to many who came before her. History is full of leaders who began as reformers and ended as rulers of routine. Paul Biya in Cameroon, Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, all men who once promised liberation and then chained it. Their names form a cautionary litany of ambition without humility. But history also remembers those who chose differently. Nelson Mandela, who stepped down when he could have stayed. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who conceded defeat when she might have contested. Hifikepunye Pohamba in Namibia, who honored limits written not in law but in conscience. The moment confronting Tanzania now will reveal whether its leadership follows fear or faith. Because fear governs through control. Faith governs through trust. Across the continent, the image of Captain Ibrahim Traore has become shorthand for defiance, a reminder that courage does not always wear medals. The Ibrahim Traore moment has come to symbolize the instant when a generation refuses inheritance without justice. And what is emerging in Tanzania may yet become an Ibrahim Traore reaction. Not rebellion in uniform, but renewal in unity. The internet will return. Connections will refresh. Markets will reopen. Foreign investors will speak again of stability. But beneath that veneer, something irreversible has begun. Young Tanzanians have tasted agency, and there is no censorship strong enough to unlearn that flavor. They have understood that freedom is not granted, it is exercised. That silence is not safety, it is surrender. And that the only true order worth defending is one born from consent, not fear. When the curfew finally lifts, the streets will fill again. Life will resume, prices will rise, and headlines will move on. Yet somewhere between the headlines and the hashtags, a deeper story will persist, that of a people who saw darkness not as ending, but as seed time. Because every night eventually meets its morning. The curfew will lift at dawn, but when the sun rises, will Tanzania wake renewed or resume pretending? Freedom, like light, does not ask for permission to enter it, only needs a crack. And in Tanzania, that crack has already appeared. The curfew may have silenced footsteps, the internet may have gone dark, but truth is traveling by word of mouth, by memory, by courage. You cannot shut down what people have already begun to believe. Every generation must decide what kind of story it will leave behind, one of endurance or one of transformation. The young Tanzanians standing in that silence have chosen transformation. They are not merely reacting to repression. They are reclaiming authorship. What they are writing is not a protest, but a prophecy that Africa's youth will no longer be governed by fear disguised as order. For those who remember the Ibrahim Traore moment, it was never about one man in uniform. It was about the moral clarity of resistance that instant, when conviction outweighs comfort, when a voice decides it would rather speak and risk everything than remain silent and lose the soul. That same current now runs through Dar es Salaam, through Arusha, through every heart that has grown weary of waiting. And perhaps what we are witnessing is the next Ibrahim Traore reaction. Not military defiance, but moral defiance. Not coups, but courage. Not the seizure of power, but the reclaiming of purpose. The night will not last. The silence will not win. So, to everyone watching, whether from Ghana or Georgia, from Nairobi or New Orleans, your witness matters. Subscribe, share, and speak. Because attention is the last defense of truth in an age that trades reality for reputation. Type your city below. Let Tanzania know it is seen. Let the youth of Africa know they are not shouting into the void. Because silence is the weapon of the powerful, but witness your witness is the language of freedom. And one day, when history rewrites this chapter, it will remember not only who ruled, but who refused to be ruled by fear.